The Feather-Lite Heart. Get back. Get away from me. Stay away from me, you evil one. Do not come against me. Do not live upon my magic. Do not make me tell your name to the great God who sent you here. Oh, you who would speak against this magic of mine, no crocodile who lives on magic will take it away from me. That is spell 131 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The Egyptians believed that when someone died, their soul left their body and wandered for a long period of time until finally it came back to the body in time to make a long and dangerous journey to eternity, to the afterlife. And so, in order to get there, the Egyptians believed that you needed a guidebook. It seemed as though they were very, very afraid of judgment. Now, they believed in the judgment, and the Bible also talks about judgment. So what I want to do tonight is tell you about the Egyptian belief in judgment and then contrast it to that which the Bible teaches. But here's this Bible text that says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due him for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad." Judgment. Many people, many cultures have the concept of judgment in their theology. And so the Egyptians seem to love the idea of the afterlife, but they had a lot of fear of death and the journey to get to the afterlife and the judgment. And so they came up with this thing called the Book of the Dead. Now, the purpose of the Book of the Dead is to assist a person to get to the afterlife. It's almost like a AAA guidebook. It tells you where to go and what to do and what to say. And so they had this book that had magic, religious spells that they were supposed to repeat when they reached certain dangers on their journey. And so when they met these dangers, they would know how to take care of them and then ultimately know how to plead in the judgment. The Book of the Dead dealt with stuff like how to reach the hereafter, how to get there, how to live once you got there, how to conquer the foes along the way, and even what to say in the judgment. Now, the Book of the Dead comes from what we call the New Kingdom period, dynasties 18 through 20. This is the time period of Tutankhamun that we've talked about. This is the time period of Ramses in the 19th dynasty. So this is later in Egyptian history. And the Book of the Dead continued, well, you can see the date there, 1558 to 1085 BC. When I say it's later in Egyptian history, we realize Egyptian history goes all the way back to 3000 BC. So this is somewhat later in the Egyptian history. The Book of the Dead, the largest one that they have found, when we say a book, we really mean it's a scroll, understand. They weren't really doing books and pages like we do today. A scroll, and it was a long scroll with writing on it. Usually they're profusely illustrated. You see this beautiful one here with the illustration and then the instructions and exactly telling you what to do when you got to the judgment scene. The largest one is the Book of the Dead of Ani, who was a scribe. It's 78 feet long. Very beautiful. I've seen this. This happens to be in a museum in Berlin. The smallest one is just a scrap of papyrus about as big as your thumbnail that they quickly wrote like one spell on. Now, it was a strange thing that it was kind of like if you had one spell, you had them all, at least at some points in time. So it was efficient just to have the one spell written on a piece of papyrus, very tiny. But of course, the larger ones were for people who had More money. That's always been the case, hasn't it? The deluxe style was for the people with money. Some things never change. Now, when we say the Book of the Dead, there is not really an exact edition. Like if I tell you about Moby Dick, you can pick up a copy of Moby Dick that was the first printing and a copy of Moby Dick that's published today. And it's probably going to be very similar. But the Book of the Dead is kind of a general term for these papyri, for these scrolls, that ultimately, altogether, contain about 200 spells, but no one Book of the Dead contains all 200 spells. You understand? So it's kind of a general term for a group of different texts, but all of them are called the Book of the Dead. Now, the roots of the Book of the Dead are in very ancient times. The roots of the Book of the Dead go all the way back to the Old Kingdom period, the kingdom of the kingdom of the pyramids. And in the Old Kingdom period, dynasties 5 and 6, they used to write a lot of spells on the inside of the tomb or of the pyramid. Here's the pyramid of Unas at a place called Saqqara. Saqqara is also where this step pyramid is, the first real pyramid ever built. But nearby at Saqqara is this pyramid of Unas. Now, it doesn't look like much of a pyramid, but you can see the pyramid shape still there. It's very badly destroyed. And this is the first pyramid to use pyramid texts. All of the burial chamber is covered with these hieroglyphs carved into the stone. Very, very beautiful. Here's another one. This is the pyramid of Teti. I showed you a picture of the pyramid of Teti. I visited that when I was in Egypt a few years ago. And I took this picture down in the burial chamber, even though the guard was in the other room saying, "No photos, no photos." Well, I was always a slow learner in school. So I took this picture of these hieroglyphs inside the pyramid of Teti. And the walls, all the wall space is totally covered. And here you see Teti's name. Remember I told you this was called the cartouche. And Teti's name is here in this cartouche. And so the original texts were written on the walls of the pyramids. Now they're kind of strange in that one would ask for protection by Osiris, who's the god of the underworld. I'll tell you about him in a moment. And some of the texts asks for protection from Osiris. So there's some contradiction in them. They're very fascinating to see, these pyramid texts. And here's a picture of what the pyramid texts probably actually looked like in ancient times. We look at these ancient Egyptian monuments and they're rock, right? Red rock or gray. We see the pyramids inside. The walls are just plain. You have all these intricate carvings. But in ancient times, that is not the way it was. They were painted. And so those pyramid texts in the pyramid of Teti would have originally looked more like this, with a black background or a red background. And each individual hieroglyph brilliantly painted. And you see these big, huge monuments, these big, huge statues at the temples. They were all painted. Must have been incredibly beautiful when they were all painted and very, very colorful. Well, during the later time of the Old Kingdom, it's a time period called the First Intermediate Period. The pyramids were broken into, and for the first time, the commoners began to see how the pharaohs lived, and they saw these spells that were written up on the walls for protection for primarily just the pharaohs and the nobles. And the commoners began to say, "We want those," which makes sense, right? It's the good old American way. You want what you don't have, right? And so the next time period, the major time period, it's called the Middle Kingdom, the commoners start using texts on their sarcophagi. And the sarcophagus is just a coffin. In essence, just a coffin. And so during the Middle Kingdom period, and this lasts also into the New Kingdom period, they started painting all these hieroglyphs on the coffins or on the sarcophagi, inside and out. And they're very, very different looking, and yet they all have the spells written on the coffins. And these are called the coffin texts, by the way. Now, there's something interesting about all of these. One common characteristic about all of these. Let me show you again. Do you see one common characteristic about all of them? What? They have eyes. Why do they have eyes? So the dead person can see the text on the outside of the coffin. Have to have eyes to be able to look around outside. And so all of these ancient sarcophagi had eyes on them so that they could see out of their coffin to read the spells. Well, this proved to be a difficult thing to do. And so by the time they came to the New Kingdom period, they began to put all these spells, collect them together, and put them in a papyrus or on a scroll, which we call the Book of the Dead. They were collected, and in many cases, they were actually buried with the mummy, sometimes even wrapped up in the mummy wrappings or just put in the sarcophagus. And some of them are just so beautiful and very, very elaborate. In Egyptian theology, when one died, one would start on a journey. And the journey was to the west. Remember, I quoted Horace Greeley, who said, "Go west, young man, go west." And that's what the ancient Egyptians realized. You probably have never thought about it in this way, but all of the pyramids and all of the major burial grounds, there are a few graves on the east side of the Nile, but all the pyramids and all the major necropolises in Egypt are on the west side of the Nile. It's because when a person died, they journeyed from the east to the west. And so all of them are on the west side of the Nile because of this idea of going west. And so I showed you this picture the other night from King Tut's tomb, a small boat about this big that was in his tomb because he needed to be ferried across the Nile so that he could go to his afterlife. I spoke about this, but I didn't show you a picture. Beside the Great Pyramid of Cheops in Giza, there was this huge pit that they discovered. And in the pit was this boat, which had been disassembled piece by piece and hidden in this pit. And they came back 4,000 years later. Archaeologists found this pit. And because it was so well sealed, they discovered this wooden boat still in incredible preservation. And they have reconstructed this boat. And it sits right by the Pyramid of Cheops, the Great Pyramid. Now, have any of you seen this? It looks very strange because you have this wonderful ancient pyramid, and then right next to it you have this building that houses the ship that looks, for all practical purposes, like a UFO. It's kind of soft corners and kind of shaped like this. It's like they needed to hire an architect for that. They just did not know what they were doing. But it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing to see right there on the Giza Plateau. To come from the Nile River up to Cheops's pyramid, or all the pyramids, they actually flooded it so they could float the body up on one of these ships. And so from the Nile River up to the pyramids, they built a causeway which they flooded so the body could be taken directly to the pyramid. It's all based on go west, young man, go west. Well, when the actual journey beyond the boat started, one of the first things that the person would face in their journey to the afterlife was to encounter the great water snake. Sound scary to you? Not really. But it didn't sound scary to the Egyptian either, because there was a spell in the Book of the Dead, a magic spell, that if you quoted this spell on your journey, you think about the people having consciousness, you see, on their way to the journey. If you quoted this spell, he was defeated. It worked every time. And so you had to have the spell to be able to defeat the great water snake. Now, you probably need to understand ancient magic just a little bit. For us, just saying something doesn't necessarily make it true. But to the ancient Egyptians, there was power in the spoken word. It is said, it is the fact that the book of the, or let me try this again. The fact that the Book of the Dead said that these words would conquer dangers made it so. Now, there sounds a little bit like faith to me. You know, there's certain things in the Bible that frankly don't make sense to me. Forgive me for saying that. I don't understand them, but I believe them because the Bible says it so. And so that's kind of the way the Book of the Dead functioned for the Egyptians. Some of these spells sound kind of lame, to be honest with you. But because they're in the Book of the Dead, and the Book of the Dead promised that if you say these spells, it will eliminate the dangers, the people believed it. And plus there was also this idea of power in the name. Now, you'll find this in a number of different cultures, this idea of the power in the name. Sometimes when people have gotten into things like exorcism, they say if you know the name of the demon, even in Scripture, one time Jesus asked a demon, what's your name? And he said, Legion. You remember that? The idea was if you knew someone's name, you had power over him or her. And so many times the spells say things like this: I know your name. I know you. I know who you are. And so by calling people's names, you could take control and power over them by calling them by their name and rebuking them and then just passing on. So there's power in the name. Now, that's still true, isn't it? Even today, one of the first things that salesmen are taught, one of the first things preachers are taught, to be honest, is to call people by their first name. And once you start calling people by their first name, you start developing a relationship with that person. So there's power in the name, and the Egyptians believed that. There's also in the Book of the Dead these decrees that are very interesting. One of them says, King Teti has not died to death. He does not die. This king lives forever. And so by declaring it to be true, because of these religious magic spells, by declaring it to be true, the Egyptians believed that it would be true. Now, if you can understand that, then you can understand the purpose of the Book of the Dead in order to help them get to the afterlife. In Egypt, there was even a spell, I'm talking about names, there was even a spell to help you to not forget your name, because you wanted to take control over other people, but there was also a spell that helps you not to forget your name, because if you forgot your name, then you were lost forever, in essence. Well, the person has to take this long, arduous journey to get to the judgment scene. And the Book of the Dead helps them get there. But the Book of the Dead also helps them at the judgment scene. But before we do the judgment scene, I need to tell you a little story to help you understand the main players in the judgment scene. This is the story of Osiris and Isis. Osiris was once a living ruler upon this earth. By the way, we learned this story from a Greek historian who recorded the story of Isis and Osiris. Osiris was once upon a time a living king on earth. He was married to his sister, whose name was Isis. This happens all the time in Egyptian mythology. So he was married to his sister Isis. And his sister's name, by the way, means great of magic. They had an evil brother whose name was Set or Seth, depending on how you pronounce it. He was evil. And he married the fourth member of the family, whose name was Nephthys. Two sisters who married two brothers. Two are good, two are bad. So, one day, while Seth was by the river Nile, he decided to trick his brother Osiris. And so Seth was building a coffin, making a coffin, and he says to Osiris, he says, "Hey Osiris, come check this out and see if the size is okay." You see what's coming, right? So Osiris gets in a coffin. Seth slams the lid shut, throws it in the Nile River, and it floats downstream. And of course, Osiris dies in this coffin in the Nile River. Well, of course, Isis is heartbroken, and so she goes and finds her husband's body where it has been carried by the Nile and brings it back to Egypt. At which point in time, as she is crying over the body, Set grabs the body, ripped it into 14 pieces, and threw them into the Nile. And being a loving, dedicated, devoted wife, what happens? Well, Isis goes along and collects all of the pieces of her husband's ripped up body, collects them. Every place she finds a piece of the body, she builds a temple. And this is one of the ways the Egyptians accounted for some of the temples that were built in their empire. She collects all the pieces, she builds a temple, she brings the body back, she sews it back together, and then she transforms herself into a bird. It's called a kite, a bird. And she wings her way over her husband, and with the breath of her wings, she breathes life into his dead body and brings him, well, kind of back to life. And this is why this is a very popular motif. I'll show it to you here on a sarcophagus. A very popular motif on a sarcophagus is Isis with her bird wings breathing breath into the dead person, you see. Extremely common. And once you see this motif, you get turned on to this idea when you go to an Egyptian museum, you see it on almost every single sarcophagus. It's really fun to pick up on these clues. Well, as if it's not already strange enough, what happens next is that from the resurrected soul of her husband, Isis and Osiris have a child. His name is Horus. And Horus becomes the god of the living, the overworld, and Osiris becomes the god of the underworld. Father and son. Now it gets really strange, even more strange, as if it's not strange enough, right? It gets even more strange in that, Horus is the god of the overworld. Osiris is the god of the underworld. And I should tell you too, Horus is usually like the protector of the Pharaoh. And so you'll often see Horus with like a son or a child in front of him as he's protecting the Pharaoh. Well, during this time when they're all fighting together, Horus gets mad at his mother, Isis, and he cuts her head off. Nice, right? And because a god can't be headless, the closest thing around is a cow. And so someone cuts the head off the cow and sews it onto Isis's body, and that's why you have another god whose name is Hathor. But Isis never ceases to live too. So are you totally confused? Well, you should be. Because it makes no sense. It just makes absolutely no sense. Well, you kind of got the idea. The Egyptian theological construct is not really that impressive. So, you understand now the main characters, and you understand that Osiris is the god of the underworld. He is the god of the judgment. And so, when a person comes to judgment, they know that they will meet Osiris. Always meets Osiris, and he has the power of life, afterlife, and death. He has the power to let you go to heaven or to consign you to oblivion. And so everyone appears before Osiris. There is a jury of 42, what they call demigods, or those are kind of like lesser gods. And there is the god called Thoth, who is sitting there ready to write the verdict. You see Thoth here. He's the ibis-headed god. Person here appears before Osiris. Thoth is there ready. And so this is the time when the Book of the Dead comes into account again. So the Book of the Dead has these statements that a person is supposed to say when they're standing before Osiris. The deceased one is supposed to say, I did not do this, I did not do this, I did not do this, and confess any wrongs that they did not do, because they never did anything bad, according to the Book of the Dead, right? Of the 10 commandments, 8 of the 10 are represented. It's interesting that 8 of our 10 commandments are listed as these confessions that the deceased one says, I never did any of these things. And the ones that are missing are the first commandment, which forbids no other gods. Well, the Egyptians had about 2,000 of them, so this really wasn't an issue. And the other one is missing is no images. And of course, you have all the images of the gods. So these two weren't issues for the ancient Egyptians. And so the person stands up before Osiris and says, I have not done this, I have not done that. And the demigods are standing there ready to take note so that they can help give the verdict. So here's some examples from the Book of the Dead. It says, O bone breaker who comes from Heliopolis, I have told no lies. O green flame who comes from Memphis, I have not stolen food. O Nefertim who comes from Memphis, I have not done anything wrong. I have witnessed no crime. That's spell 125. And so continually the person says, I haven't done this, I haven't done that, until finally at the end of the judgment scene, the heart is produced from the body. The heart is taken out of the body. You might remember this if you're here the night I talked about mummification, that usually the hearts were left in the body at mummification. This is one of the reasons why. Because when they got to the judgment, the heart had to be produced. Remember, there's only one part, I told you this on that same night, there's only one part of the body that was discarded at mummification, and it was the brain, because they didn't know what it was used for. The heart of emotion, the heart of knowledge, the heart of evil was your heart. It was here. And so when they got to the judgment, they took the heart out of the body, and here spell 30, it says, O my heart, do not stand as witness against me. Do not oppose me in the judgment. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance. So the heart was taken, and the heart was put on one side of a balance. The idea was that if you had done evil, it would be lodged in your heart. It would make your heart heavy. And so your heart would be put on one side of the balance, and on the other side of the balance, a feather. Uh-oh. The feather stood for Ma'at. which couldn't be defined as the ideal way of truth, justice, and charity, the right thing to do. So your heart was balanced against living a perfect lifestyle, the ideal lifestyle. And they were, of course, the heart was supposed to be lighter. If it was heavier, here's this guy right here. His name is the Eater. His name is the Eater. You can see him right there by the balance, looking hungrily. He's also called the devourer of shades, or the eater. And if the heart weighs more than the feather, he gets to eat the heart. And the deceased dies the second death. It's interesting, though, because they had the Book of the Dead. Poor, hungry eater. Because of the Book of the Dead, the eater never got to eat. Never got a bite of that heart, because when you got to the right spot, the Book of the Dead would get you through to paradise, get you through to the afterlife. OSIRIS would declare that this person is true of voice. You see this on many, those little shabtis that I've shown you before. Oftentimes you'll see a person's name and it'll say on there, true of voice. They're declared true of voice, which in essence is the endorsement that they can go to the afterlife, and then after the judgment, they pass into the afterlife and enjoy their life in what would be their heaven. Now, when I tell you all this, it sounds like it's strongly ethical, because the person is confessing that they didn't do this and didn't do that. Well, it is ethical in that it's obvious that they considered many of these things wrong. But it's not ethically based in the fact that it didn't really matter if they did them or not. They didn't really have to live that kind of life. All they had to do was have the Book of the Dead that could tell them how to plead so that they could lie right, you see. So there's really no ethical living. It's ethical talking is really what it was all about. And so the Book of the Dead enabled them to get to the afterlife. And so having the afterlife, or having success in the afterlife, really depended upon if you had enough money to buy a good Book of the Dead to help guide you to the afterlife. And it was dependent on whether you could use the spells correctly to control the gods and receive safe passage until finally you got to the afterlife. And this is what the Egyptian belief was. Everything was for the afterlife. I've told you this before a couple times, but they buried all these things with people in their tombs, not because they were tomb offerings, but because they were things that they would need when they got to the afterlife. And so getting to the afterlife was the most important thing possible. It seems as though they feared the judgment. And so that's why they had to come up with this extremely complicated way to get through the judgment. Now, I would suggest to you that fear of the judgment that they had is not that uncommon even today. I think a lot of people are afraid of the judgment. I had a relative, she's now dead. I won't tell you who she was. But she had this saying, she would always say, God will get them for that. And I think there are many people that believe that. Here's this BARNA poll. Now, BARNA is like the pollster for the religious world, like Gallup is for the secular world. So BARNA had this poll and asked people to respond to this question. Eventually, all people will be personally judged by God. 1,205 people responded, and 74% said they strongly agree, and 11% said they somewhat agree. And these were Christians, by the way. 85% said they strongly believe or somewhat agree that people will ultimately be personally judged by God. Now, it's interesting that there was some differences by gender. Men who strongly agreed, 70%. Women who strongly agreed, 78%. You can do anything you want to with that statistic, but I'm going to leave it alone. I'm smarter than that. No, I'm just keep going. There's some difference by age. 66 to 98 agreed strongly, whereas 18 through 27, only 67% agreed strongly. So there seems to be some gender gap, some age gap, and also some gap amongst Christian denominations. People who identified themselves as Protestant, 82%. People who identified themselves as Catholic, 78%. People who identified themselves as Baptist, 90%. I would guess that's a little bit of that hellfire brimstone Baptist theology going on there. Mainline Protestants, 79%. Churched people, 81%. Unchurched people, only 49% believe that people would ultimately face a judgment. So this idea of facing a judgment is not at all uncommon. And one statistic I don't have on there is that there were some anxieties from some people because 32% on this survey said that they believe there are sins God can't forgive. So if you're part of that 32% and you believe you've committed one of those sins that God cannot forgive, you probably have a great fear of the judgment, a great fear. The Bible contrasts the ideas that we've seen in the Egyptian judgment with some very interesting different ideas. Let me just share with you again this text, 2 Corinthians 5:10. It says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due him for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad." It says every single one of us will appear before the judgment seat of Christ. So every single one of us face judgment. Now, does judgment sound scary to you, or does it sound hopeful to you? And it all depends on how you think the judge is going to look at you when you get there. It depends, if someone has wronged you and you take them to court, is the court good news or bad news? It's good news. If you're the one being taken to court, well, it could be bad news. And so there's this interplay between good news and bad news in the judgment. But it says, as far as the judgment seat of Christ, we will all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Here's this next text, Acts 17:31. It even gets more specific. It says, "For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead." Jesus obviously is being talked about there. And so it says, God has actually set a day when he will judge the world by justice. So we are facing a judgment. Scripture says it. And it actually tells us when it will be in general terms here. In Revelation 22, verse 12, John writes this. Actually, he's quoting Jesus. He says, "Behold, I am coming soon. My reward is with me, and I will give to everyone according to what he has done." The judgment happens before the second coming of Jesus. Because when Jesus comes, he comes with his reward. Therefore, the judgment must have already happened at this point in time. And so I believe the Bible teaches, in theological terms, we call this the pre-Advent judgment. Not only that, the Scripture tells us a little bit more here in Revelation 14, 6 and 7. This is in Revelation. If you follow through, this is in the time just before the second coming of Jesus. If you follow through the passages, John writes this, "Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come." So when this angel is proclaiming his message before the coming of Jesus, the hour of his judgment has come already. And what does that fact that the hour of his judgment has come make us need to do? It makes us need to fear him and then worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. This text tells us to worship God. This text, I have to tell you, is evolution buster, because it points us back to the God who was the God of creation, who created the world in 7 days. It says to worship that God. Evolution doesn't work in this text. So we're told again that the judgment will happen before the coming of Jesus. As a matter of fact, this judgment happens when this angel is proclaiming his message. And I don't have time to be able to do all of the work tonight, but in the book of Daniel, it actually points out when the judgment would begin, and that happened, according to the book of Daniel, in 1844. Wish I had time to unpack that, but I'd like you to be home by breakfast in the morning. But the judgment happens before the second coming of Jesus. Now, in the Egyptian method of judgment, the heart is judged. Mot, ideal, is the standard. In God's judgment, what is judged? Here's this text in Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of men. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. What will God bring into judgment? Our deeds. Now, some people have been confused about this because we are not saved. Our salvation in Jesus is not based on our deeds, is it? No. We are saved by the grace of God and accepting that by faith. In other words, we don't work our way to heaven. Why then are our deeds the standard by which we will be judged? Because our deeds show what's in our hearts. Our deeds will show whether or not we are living in a grace, faith-filled life. Let me give you an example of this. Matthew chapter 25, verse 40. This is a parable called the parable of the sheep and the goats. Do you remember this parable? Jesus takes everyone and puts the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. Sorry, people, I'm really not calling you goats over there. The right hand of the sheep, the left hand of the goats. What is the determining factor as to whether he puts them on the right hand or the left hand? Verse 40 tells us, the king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of one of these my brothers and sisters, you did for me." Judgment is based on our deeds, because our deeds reflect whether or not we love God and whether or not we love Jesus. That makes sense? So, truly I say to you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. I'll remind you of this text also. It's John 14, verse 15. Jesus says, "If you love me, you will obey what I command. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments." So, our deeds, how we obey his commands, is evidence of whether or not we love him. Am I making that plain to you? So therefore, our deeds are evidence for the judgment. What else will we be judged by? Here's James chapter 2, verse 12. He says, "Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom Interesting way to talk about the Ten Commandments, I think. The law that gives freedom. Well, just a little bit more about the judgment. This is kind of exciting. John 5:22 says, "Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son." I have a relative who used to say to me that they liked Jesus, but God, not so much. Because they saw God as the great judge on the throne up there who wants to fry you. And Jesus is the one who intercedes in between for you. And if it weren't for Jesus, you'd be fried a long time ago. Some people have that view of God. But that's not the biblical view of God. 1 John says God is love. So this text, John 5:22 says, "The Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son." That's Jesus. So Jesus will be in charge of the judgment. That's good news. More good news here. 1 John chapter 2, verse 1. 1 John 2, verse 1. It says, "My dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have one who speaks to the Father in our defense, Jesus Christ, the righteous one." Some translations say advocate. We have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ. An advocate, if you've ever been in the court system, and I hope you haven't, but an advocate is someone who's on your side. If you're being prosecuted, you have an advocate who is on your side. And so just think about this. John 5:22 says that Jesus is our judge. This text says Jesus is our advocate, our defense attorney, for lack of a better term. How would you feel if you had to go to court and you walked in with your lawyer who you know is on your side, and someone says, "All rise," and your lawyer walks up and sits down where the judge sits? You know he's on your side, right? So he'd say, "How do you plead?" And he'd get down from the seat and come down beside you and stand by your side. "We plead not guilty." And he gets up and goes back on the, you see? You kind of can't lose in that case, right? Jesus is on our side in the judgment. That's good news. If you're on Jesus' side, there's no reason to be afraid of the judgment. That's good news. Some people think that in the end, Satan and his demons will be in charge of hell and will be in charge of the judgment. In actual fact, if you read the book of Revelation, Satan and his demons are judged, not in charge of the judgment. They are not in charge of hell. They are victims of hell, the fires of hell. And so this idea that Satan's down there somewhere in the earth, and cooking sinners and rolling them over every 1,000 years to make sure they get done all the way around, that's silliness. We're going to talk about that another night. But Jesus is the one who is in charge of our judgment and of our salvation. Here's one last text that I think is really, really good news from the book of Daniel. Daniel 7, verses 9 and 10. Daniel says this: "As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat." That's God the Father. "His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon 10,000s attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened." Some translations say the judgment was set, and the books were opened. This is the judgment scene of Daniel. It's a wonderful judgment scene, wonderful story. the judgment scene of Daniel. God is there. Jesus is there. All the holy angels are there. Thousands of thousands, 10,000 times 10,000. They're there. And the judgment is set, and the books are opened. If you continue reading down through Daniel chapter 9, there are a number of things that happen. Jesus comes, and then there's the judgment of this character in Daniel chapter 7, who's named the little horn and the beast. There's judgment. And then at the very end of it all, Daniel 7:22, it says this, that the judgment happens until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. Did you see that first part? The judgment is given, pronounced, in favor of the saints of the Most High. In the ancient Egyptian study, in the ancient Egyptian book, you had to have the right book, and you had to have enough money to buy the right book so that you could be successful in the judgment. But in God's judgment, how can you be successful? Be on God's side. Judgment is given in favor of the saints of the Most High. Forgive me for just a second. I don't want to brag, but I've already won in the judgment. As long as I remain faithful to Jesus in my life, I have no question, I have no qualm about what my judgment will be. Saved by the grace of God and able to enter into heaven as one of the saints of the Most High. That's the way we get through the judgment. The Egyptians didn't understand that, but I'm glad I do. I'd like to close this part with a word of prayer together. Let's just please bow our heads and we'll pray together. Dear Lord, I thank you for this opportunity tonight to have this good news of the judgment. The good news that we can have a favorable judgment. We can make it to life eternal because we're on your side. And I pray, Lord, that you'd help each person here tonight just to determine to be on your side. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.